Arrogance is rarely loud at the beginning. It usually starts in private certainty, in the quiet confidence of a person who believes they understand exactly how much can be hidden, how long a lie can survive, and how carefully other people are or are not paying attention. That is what many betrayals are built on. Not only desire, not only loneliness, not only weakness, confidence. Confidence that the house will keep functioning while truth is quietly removed from it. Confidence that children are too distracted to notice, parents are too polite to ask, and the spouse at the center of it all is too calm to act before being forced. What people like that fail to understand is that lies do not stay private just because they are spoken softly. Once betrayal enters a family, it changes the emotional air before it changes the facts. And families, especially the ones who have lived around you longest, often smell dishonesty before the liar realizes the room has changed. I learned that later than I should have. For most of my adult life, I believed restraint was a kind of protection. I thought if a man stayed measured, handled his responsibilities, and refused to mistake suspicion for proof, then the people closest to him would eventually understand the weight of that steadiness. That was one of my blind spots. Another was more flattering, which usually means more dangerous. I believed that because I was observant, I would catch betrayal before it became structurally humiliating. I did not understand then that noticing something and permitting yourself to believe it are two different skills. Calm men often see the truth early and still delay action because they do not want to become unjust before they become certain. By the time certainty arrives, the lie has often already spread much farther than they imagined. My name is Aaron Mercer. I'm 48 years old, and until a little over a year ago, I had been married for 17 years to a woman named Claire. We lived outside Columbus, in a neighborhood built for the optics of stable adulthood. Wide lawns, respectable brick, good schools, minivans with clean interiors, and the quiet assumption that most people were more settled than they really were. We had 2 children. My daughter, Ellie, was 19 and away at college. My son, Mason, was 15 and still at home. I worked in vendor compliance and operational controls for a medical supply network, which meant contracts, exceptions, audit exposure, and the dull but necessary work of making sure people with more charisma than discipline did not cost the company too much money by calling improvisation strategy. I liked that work because it rewarded sequence. It rewarded seeing the difference between the official story and the actual trail. At work, if something didn't add up, I followed it. At home, I gave love more interpretive mercy than it deserved. Claire worked in strategic communications for a regional university. She was sharp, attractive, socially fluent, and very good at using language to make other people feel more articulate than they actually were. When we met, I admired that. I was steadier, more inward, more comfortable with substance than atmosphere. She brought motion into my life. I brought structure into hers. At least that was the story we told ourselves in the years when it still felt true. And to be fair, it had been true for a long time. I do not need to rewrite the early marriage into something false just because the ending became ugly. There was real love. We survived my mother's illness, one miscarriage between our 2 children, a relocation we hadn't planned, and the ordinary exhaustion of raising a family while both trying to stay recognizable to yourselves. There were years of tenderness, years of loyalty, years in which I would have trusted her not because I was naive, but because the trust had been earned. If I am going to tell this honestly, I should say something unflattering about myself before I say more about her. I was too proud of being the stable one. Not publicly. Quietly. The kind of male pride that hides in usefulness and calls itself humility. I handled the mortgage, the college savings, the taxes, the insurance, the home repairs, the retirement allocations, the quiet adult machinery that keeps a family from living in a permanent state of small avoidable emergencies. I did it because I was good at it and because someone needed to. But there is a danger in carrying too much of a life well. People adapt to the result and stop seeing the labor. If they are selfish enough, they start experiencing the stability you provide as background rather than character. If they become arrogant enough, they begin imagining that their life simply works because life is working, not because someone is quietly preventing it from breaking. Claire used to call me steady. Later she called me safe. Later than that, The word started sounding less affectionate and more diagnostic. Steady became predictable. Predictable became unexciting. Unexciting became easy to underestimate. That shift did not happen in one conversation. It accumulated in tone, in comparison, in the faint impatience that appears when your virtues have stopped flattering someone's imagination. That, I have learned, is how a lot of marital contempt begins. Not with screaming, with recategorization. The first real fracture in our marriage was not another man. It was asymmetry. Claire's emotional life became increasingly central, while mine became increasingly logistical. If she felt restless, that was meaningful. If I felt uneasy, that was me overthinking. If she needed space, that was healthy. If I asked for clarity, I was making things heavy. That phrase, making things heavy, became one of her favorites. It let her avoid directness while making my seriousness sound like the problem. I should have recognized sooner that when one spouse starts treating the other's need for truth as emotional excess, the marriage is already shifting into dangerous territory. But I did what many decent husbands do too long. I stayed fair. I kept trying to interpret her in the kindest way possible. That is admirable in the right context. In the wrong one, it is simply expensive. The other man was named Daniel. He worked in external partnerships for the university, which meant donor events, sponsorships, and the usual institutionally respectable excuses for repeated closeness outside normal hours. I met him once at a campus reception. Good suit. Polished smile. The kind of man who understands exactly how much listening is required for people to start calling him thoughtful. Claire mentioned him enough that I noticed, and not so much that I felt entitled to challenge it immediately. Daniel had strong instincts. Daniel understood institutional politics. Daniel was one of the only people who could actually talk about certain things without flattening them. None of that was proof. That's the trouble. Betrayal, while it's still being careful, rarely introduces itself in sentences that can survive quotation. I noticed the practical things first. More late evenings. More donor dinners. More defensiveness around simple questions that had once produced simple answers. A brightness in her face when she read certain messages. The kind of private smile adults make when they are having a conversation that flatters some part of themselves they no longer bring home honestly. But I kept arguing with my own perception. I did not want to become the husband who pollutes a marriage with ugly assumptions simply because the emotional weather has changed. Looking back, I understand that I was still protecting not only her, but the older version of our life that had once earned that protection. The affair would probably have stayed in ambiguity longer if it had remained only between adults. That is what people like Claire always count on. They imagine secrecy in romantic terms. Hidden messages, hidden meetings, hidden facts. They rarely think enough about emotional leakage, about the way attention shifts, about the way a person's center of gravity moves before their story changes. Children and parents often notice that before the betrayer does. The first person in our family to say something was not me. It was my daughter. Ellie was home from college for a long weekend in October. She had always been observant in the particular way serious daughters often are. Quietly, without making themselves the center of anything, but attentive enough that when they say something you should probably listen. We were in the kitchen one afternoon, just the two of us, because Claire had gone out for what she called a donor brunch. Ellie was slicing apples and said, as casually as a person can say something that changes a marriage, "Mom acts weird when Daniel texts." I remember going still without wanting her to notice I had gone still. I asked, carefully, "What do you mean?" She shrugged. Nothing huge. Just too alert, I guess. Like she's not in the room anymore. Then she looked at me and added, "I thought maybe you already knew." That sentence stays with me even now. Not because it was dramatic. Because it was clean. It told me the lie had already become visible enough that my daughter assumed I must be seeing the same thing. In other words, the affair, or at least the emotional migration around it, was no longer hidden inside the marriage. It was changing the behavior of the house. I did not ask her anything else. Children, even adult children, should not be made into witnesses against their parents because their parents have failed morally. But I heard her, and I should have acted more quickly than I did. Instead, I still hesitated. Not because I doubted her, because I still wanted a cleaner piece of evidence before I turned my marriage into a confrontation that would touch the whole family. That delay is one of the things I judge most harshly in myself now. Not because it came from weakness, because it came from a false assumption that the lie was still containable if I kept handling it carefully. It wasn't. The next person to notice was my son. Mason and I were in the garage one evening looking for a pump needle for a basketball when he said, almost absent-mindedly, "Mom's been taking calls outside a lot." I asked what kind of calls. He shrugged. "I don't know. The ones where she smiles first and then comes back in acting normal." Children can be terrifyingly precise when they are not trying. He did not know enough to name what he was seeing. But what he described was not innocent. It was the behavioral split that often appears when someone is living in two emotional realities at once. The smile that belongs to one world, followed by the performance of normalcy in the other. My 15-year-old son noticed that before I allowed myself to say the word affair aloud in my own mind with full seriousness. That should have shamed me more than it did in the moment. At the time, it mostly clarified something I had been resisting. The truth had already escaped private containment. The family was not discovering facts yet. They were discovering atmosphere. And atmosphere, once damaged, is much harder to repair than a single lie. Then my sister noticed. My sister Rebecca came by one Sunday afternoon with coffee and one of those absurdly expensive grocery store cakes she always bought when she felt family life had gotten too heavy and dessert should count as emotional intervention. She had known Claire long enough to understand her normal social rhythm. While we were cleaning up after dinner, she said quietly, "Is everything all right with you too?" I gave her the standard answer. Busy stretch. Normal strain. Teenagers. Work. Rebecca looked at me for a moment and said, "No, this is different. She keeps checking out of the room before anyone else does." That phrase was exact. Checking out of the room. Not physically leaving. Emotionally vacating before her body followed. Once again, someone else in the family had noticed the structural thing before I had fully acted on it. That mattered. It meant the affair wasn't just a private betrayal in progress. It was becoming a social distortion inside our own family system. And Claire, in her confidence, either did not see that or believed the rest of us were too polite to trust what we were noticing. That is one of the biggest mistakes arrogant people make. They believe secrecy is a function of what they conceal, when in reality secrecy fails first through the emotional burden they place on everyone nearby. They make the room do too much work. The actual evidence came a week later. A family cloud storage folder. That's all it took. We had shared drives for tax forms, tuition receipts, medical paperwork, travel documents. One night, while pulling insurance paperwork for an FSA reimbursement, I found a PDF with a meaningless file name in the wrong folder. It was a hotel confirmation for a 2-night stay in Cincinnati, booked under Claire's name on dates she had described as a university regional retreat. The forwarding chain beneath it included Daniel's email and a secondary booking note that no serious adult could reinterpret charitably once seen clearly. There were also images. A few photos saved automatically from her phone backup before she realized the sync still fed the family drive. A rooftop dinner, his hand at the small of her back, a mirror reflection in a hotel elevator, and one picture of them at breakfast looking less like two guilty adults in a secret and more like two people who had already started imagining themselves as a pair. The affair was no longer ambiguous. But strangely, that was not the part that shook me most. What shook me most was that my children and my sister had already felt the distortion before I found the file. Claire thought the affair was a secret. In reality, the family had found out first, not by fact but by atmosphere. That is a much deeper failure of judgment than people realize. It means the liar has become so confident in her control over information that she forgets other people are still living inside the emotional consequences of her split attention. I did not confront her immediately. That matters, because I already knew what immediate confrontation would produce. Tears. Narrowing. language about confusion, claims that it was complicated, maybe even a partial confession designed to preserve as much innocence as possible while still acknowledging enough to diffuse my certainty. I did not want the first conversation to be one more space where she controlled scale. The family had already been made to carry the atmosphere of her dishonesty. I was not going to let her also control the timing and vocabulary of its exposure. So I met with an attorney first. Her name was Margaret Sloan. Early 60s. Dry voice. Very little patience for emotionally sophisticated dishonesty once paper enters the room. I laid out the evidence, the timeline, the financial overlaps, and the fact that my children and sister had already noticed enough to speak. Margaret listened and then said something that clarified the moral structure of the whole thing for me. The affair matters, she said. But the deeper issue is that she has already made the family absorb it before she had the courage to name it. That was exactly right. Claire had not kept the affair private. She had outsourced its emotional cost onto the house while still telling herself it was hidden. That is what arrogance does. It confuses lack of confrontation with lack of awareness. I changed after that. Not loudly. Quietly. I stopped asking open-ended questions whose only purpose was to give her another chance to curate reality. I stopped smoothing over silence. I stopped treating her inconsistency as whether I was responsible for interpreting sympathetically. I remained present, fatherly, civil, responsible. I paid the bills, helped Mason with school things, stayed stable for Ellie. But I withdrew one thing she had been relying on without realizing it: my participation in the performance of normality. She noticed within days. One evening she said, "You've been acting strange." I said, "No. I've just stopped helping certain things look ordinary." That landed. She did not know yet how much I knew, but she understood immediately that the room had shifted. The problem for her was that she was used to managing tone, not truth. Tone she could work with. Truth, once assembled, no longer needed her interpretation. The turning point came on a Friday evening, just before dinner. Ellie happened to be home that weekend. Mason was upstairs. Claire came in from work carrying takeout and some brittle, overbright energy I had already learned to mistrust. She found me at the dining room table with a folder in front of me. "What's this?" she asked. I said, "The part you thought was a secret." That line changed her face more quickly than anger would have. Inside the folder were the hotel confirmations, the screenshots, the timeline, the expense overlaps, and the draft petition Margaret had prepared. I did not say much. I did not need to. She looked through the first pages, then more slowly. The first emotion that appeared was not grief. It was calculation, then fear. That sequence told me everything I needed to know about what part of herself she had actually been protecting all those months. The first thing she said was not, "I'm sorry." It was, "How did you get this?" That question always interests me. It reveals that even at the edge of exposure, the liar's instinct is often still to locate the breach in control rather than face the content. I said, "The family got there before I did." That was the truest sentence available. Then I told her Ellie had noticed. Mason had noticed. Rebecca had noticed. I did not say this to shame her theatrically. I said it because it was the real story. She thought the affair existed in a secret chamber she controlled. In truth, she had already allowed its emotional shadow to fall across people she supposedly wanted to protect from it. That was the moment the truth was fully revealed. Not just that there was another man. Not just that the marriage had been breached. The deeper truth was that Claire had so completely underestimated the emotional intelligence of the people around her that she believed secrecy was still intact while her own children were already adapting to the atmosphere of her divided life. That is not just infidelity. That is arrogance of perception. She cried then. Of course she did. She said it hadn't meant to become what it became. That it started emotionally. That she had been lonely. That Daniel made her feel seen in ways she had lost in our marriage. Some of that may even have been sincerely felt. Betrayers often are sincere about their dissatisfaction. The issue is not whether they felt something. It is what they allowed that feeling to justify while everyone else in the house absorbed the confusion. Then she said the line I remember most clearly. I was trying to protect the family. No. She was protecting the affair's timing. There is a difference. I said, no. The family has been protecting your secret from you by being more honest about the atmosphere than you were. That ended the useful part of the conversation. The divorce that followed was not dramatic. It was administrative, painful, and ordinary in the way serious adult endings often are. Accounts, house, scheduling, college payments, a son trying to act less affected than he was, a daughter angrier than she knew how to express cleanly. Daniel disappeared from significance quickly once the affair stopped being contrast and started being consequence. That did not surprise me. Secondary relationships often feel profound only because someone else is still maintaining the moral structure they are violating. What stayed with me much longer was not the hotel or the pictures. It was the sequence. Ellie noticed first, then Mason, then my sister, and only after that did the file arrive in my hands. That order matters because it says something brutal and important about how lies work inside families. The liar thinks the secret belongs to her because she controls the facts. But people living nearby do not need facts to feel misalignment. They do not need explicit confession to notice that attention has migrated, warmth has become selective, and the atmosphere of home has started carrying two stories instead of one. Children, especially, feel emotional dissonance in ways adults often underestimate because children have not yet trained themselves to dismiss what they notice in order to preserve appearances. A year later, after everything was final, Claire said something to me outside one of Mason's school events. I really thought no one knew. I looked at her and said, "That was the problem. You thought secrecy meant no one could feel what you were doing. If there is anything worth understanding from my story, it is this. Affairs do not stay private just because they stay unspoken. Once betrayal enters a family, it changes posture, tone, availability, timing, and warmth. It changes how people come into rooms and leave them. It changes what children stop asking because they already sense adults are lying. It changes what siblings hear in your voice over coffee even if you haven't admitted anything yet. In other words, the secret rarely remains where the liar thinks it lives. That is why arrogance fails so often in the end. Because arrogant people always believe control over information is the same thing as control over truth. It isn't. The truth usually gets to the family first. It just doesn't always use words.